Hi, welcome to part 2 of Unit 2. And in this unit, what we're doing is we're taking a look at how cultures can vary. But in this part of the unit, we're going to focus on some concepts we need to even talk about how cultures vary. And what we're going to focus on are looking at the differences between cultural competence, cultural humility, and what I call cultural cluelessness. So I'm going to introduce you to what cultural competence has meant, where we've moved to, which is now cultural humility, and then I'm going to walk you through where next and what to look at next in our unit and how to think about all of these things. Okay, so the place that I want to start today is actually around how I came up with designing this course. So in 2005, when I was looking at this program to prepare teachers to teach English language learners, I realized that there was no one specific course that focused on culture. So I created this course. And in some ways just in time, because 2 years later the state made a requirement that a course like this did need to exist. But let's go back to why I created the course and how I came up with the ideas. So when I designed this course, there was a concept that I was holding on to, and in fact I think lots of other people were holding on to as well, called cultural competence. And this is a concept, a vocabulary term that you might have heard many times and you might even use yourself. And when I created the course, there were some ideas that I don't even think I would have articulated. I don't think I maybe even could have put into words, but these were the ideas that I had. One was that it's the role of someone to research other cultures, and you can do that through books, and that you can become an expert in a culture that's not your own. And that is, in a nutshell, that is what cultural competence means. And so in this lecture, we're going to start from that place where I was when I designed this course. And then I'm going to take you to a new place, which is cultural humility. Cultural humility is a term that if you use when you're out in a job interview, or you use with a cooperating teacher, or you use with someone else in education, they may or may not know this term. And the reason is because it's a concept that comes to us not from education, but from nursing and from social work. And I think it makes complete sense, and those of us in education who've become aware of it, we're co-opting it, we're using it because it makes sense. And I hope it makes sense to you at the end of this lecture. So in this unit, one of the first places that I'll send you is I'll send you to kind of a nifty chart that I made for you that's got 2 columns. It compares cultural competence and cultural humility. And instead of just very dryly kind of walking through that material that way, I thought I'd talk through these concepts in metaphors and see where that gets us, okay? So starting out with the idea of cultural competence, and cultural competence is this idea that it is our job to learn about other cultures, that has some implications for our teaching. One of the first things that we tended to think of with cultural competence is we thought of someone who was cosmopolitan, someone who had traveled a lot, they'd experienced a lot of things. And so when I think of that aspect of cultural competence, I think of a passport. So I'll put that here. Notice it's a U.S. passport, or rather an image of a U.S. passport. And that's important because the people who were the leaders of cultural competence were often from the U.S. or from Britain or from Australia. They were English speakers who traveled out, and think about that, they had the money, they had the resources, they had the time to travel other places, often for leisure, to kind of gather up this information. And this metaphor, the metaphor of someone who's got this passport, it's also this idea that someone can become an expert, right? That a person can become an expert. And how do they become that expert? In part by travel, in part by traveling in places where the culture, the groups, the way of life was very different. But there was another really key part, and that was the idea of how you got the information about the other countries. Besides traveling and experiencing it yourself, also there were books. And for those who bought into the idea of cultural competence, the idea is that you are looking at many, many different texts and learning all that you can about a culture. But often the information that was included in books was not written by the people who lived the culture, the people who that described their values, their way of approaching life, their perspective. So often the people who'd written the books were these people, the people who'd traveled and tried to gather this information. A great example of a resource that comes out of cultural competence is called Culturegrams. And after this lecture, I'll send you to a sample of Culturegram so that you can take a look. But a Culturegram, an example of this kind of text, was essentially like a country report. In fact, that's, I think, what they even call it, a country report, in which there'd be a paragraph about religion, a paragraph about the economy, a paragraph about the level of literacy and maybe the type of schooling. And it's not that this information isn't helpful, but there's some problems with it. For one thing, it really is only at the level of shallow culture. So earlier we talked about different concepts we need to talk about culture. And really, culturegrams and texts like this rarely got deep into what really matters for someone who lives and breathes this culture. For example, thinking about the way that I grew up in Indiana, to simply read the literacy rate for people in northern Indiana doesn't really tell you at all about how I valued things as I was growing up and what my life experience was as a farm kid with not a whole lot of money in Indiana. So there's a lot of problems. So who it's written by and the shallow culture. And there's another problem too, and that is that in like Culturegrams and other books like that, other texts like that, the focus is on the majority culture, right? So if you look up a culturegram for a country, because you find out that you have a student coming to your class from that country, a refugee who's just escaped a war or there's been a genocide, that kind of thing. If you open up Culturegrams and you read about that country, you're going to read about the majority culture. And it's very likely that the students coming to you as refugees, the reason that they're coming is because they belong to a minority group that experienced prejudice, bias, and perhaps violence, and that's why they left. And so really there's only so far that kind of thing can take you as a teacher. There's another aspect too of cultural competence that I wanted to show to you in metaphor. And you can see this, it probably makes you wince, no one likes to get a shot. But this stands for the idea of an inoculation. Like you get a shot for something and then you never get that. You get a shot for malaria so you don't get malaria. You get a shot for polio so no one gets polio. That kind of thing. And the idea behind an immunization is you do this one thing and you're done. There's nothing else to do. And that really describes the approach of cultural competence. Because with cultural competence, the idea is, okay, this summer I'm going to read about these 3 countries and I'm going to learn about them and then I'm done. I've got no more learning to do. And that is an approach to culture, really that's approach to culture with a big C. So that's assuming that culture is a fixed entity, it's not changing, and no one opts out, right? So we've talked previously about how people opt in, they opt out of of cultural ways of being, just as I opted in of different aspects of Indiana farm culture, and I opted out of others. And with this approach, cultural competence, there's not room for that kind of gray area, and there's not that room for a kind of paying attention to the differences between people. So once again, cultural competence, there are experts. Who are they usually? Not the people living and breathing the culture, but rather the people who had the resources to study it, research it, travel to that culture, and then they write about it. And you can become an expert not by living it, breathing it, traveling to it, but rather you can become an expert just by reading these texts. And the texts tend to be very shallow, and they focus on majority culture rather than the ways that cultures can be incredibly varied across people and individuals. And it's also an approach that once you put in your time, once you put in your research, you're done. You have no more work to do. And you're taken care of for life. And that once you reach kind of a certain amount of intellectual material, you're done. So that's very different from where we are now. And as I mentioned in the introduction, we've taken from the field of nursing and social work this idea of cultural humility. And I think it's very likely that this concept came about because if you're acquiring all this information, if you're traveling, if you're reading books, if you're putting in your 2 weeks reading about a country and then you consider yourself done, that's not going to help you necessarily with relationships with real people who live and breathe that culture. And I think that cultural humility is bringing this back into focus of relationships. And that's the first metaphor. So I've got here 2 coffee cups. And that is the first metaphor I think of when I think of cultural humility. Because with cultural humility, the idea is it's about relationship. It's not about your relationship with a stack of textbooks or about how much you can travel outside of the U.S. It's about getting to know other people. And notice the 2 coffee cups are right next to each other. People around you. They don't have to be halfway around the world. It can be someone who lives right in your community. And the focus is on asking very sensitive and respectful questions so that you can learn more about how individuals make sense of their cultural background. And this is all about, besides relationship and respect, this is all about paying attention to culture with the little c. Paying attention to how people opt in or they opt out. For this family, this is true, but it's not true for this family. This family buys into more traditional values. This family definitely reaches for more modern values. And so when we think about cultural humility, we start with the place of relationships. And I suspect that that was the instigation for moving in nursing and social work from cultural competence to cultural humility. Another aspect of cultural humility that I think of, and I've got a picture of a gift in a box here, is the idea of gifts. The idea that if someone takes the time to answer your questions and share with you their perspective, of course you're going to be respectful of them, and of course you're going to listen, but also you need to give back. They're giving you a gift. They're sharing their perspective with you. And so you need to give back to them as well. When I'm interviewing people to learn about their cultural perspectives, one thing that I often do is to help them with if they want pronunciation or help them with any aspect of English learning that they're working on, or if they're having trouble filling out a form or they need to write an essay, helping them with editing, that kind of thing. So this is all about reciprocation, right? A reciprocal relationship. So Not just taking, and that's what cultural competence was really about. You go in, you fly into the country, you do your tour, you take your books, and then you move on. And it's kind of it's a solo activity, you and your books, or you and your travel. And here, it's about your relationship with other people, and it's about giving back. Not just being respectful, not just listening carefully, but also giving back wherever possible. And there's another aspect of cultural humility that's quite different. As you can see here, it's a picture of a child's hand in an adult's hand. And the reason that I chose this metaphor for cultural humility is what happens if you're really talking and you're really listening is you start to realize sameness. You start to realize what is the same. And I chose this metaphor because around the world, no matter where you go, all of us love children. All parents love children. All of us feel responsibility for children in some way. But of course, the way that looks can be very different. Parents talk to children in extremely formal ways in some cultures and very, very informal ways in others. Discipline can look drastically different, which, by the way, can get you in trouble if you're traveling to a culture, if you're traveling to a country that doesn't buy into the same ideas of discipline that you do. But really, once you get past differences in discipline, differences in the way we talk to each other, which is important to know about, you come back to, but we all love children. So the place that usually you should end up with cultural humility, besides noticing the differences, is coming back to this sense of sameness. Now, let's say a little bit about that, because that's a dangerous concept for me to say, sameness, because that can lead to a different concept, which is I call cultural cluelessness. And cultural cluelessness is this idea that I don't see differences, right? You might even have heard someone say that. Maybe you've even said it at some point yourself. I don't see differences. We're all the same. Differences are just kind of the icing on the cake. The cake is the same for everyone. And that's very, very dangerous because by refusing to see culture, by refusing to see how we might talk differently to each other, how we might show respect differently, we are opening ourselves up to ignoring a big aspect of our human communication with each other. And we're very likely, if not definitely, going to experience tensions and actually believing that it's personality issues, that you simply just don't like this person because of who they are. When what you're ignoring is you're ignoring the way they're showing you respect. You're ignoring how they think about personal space or how direct they believe they should be when they give you feedback, right? Those are all cultural aspects that if you ignore, you are going to experience tensions with others and you'll see them as a personal issue rather than what they are, cultural issues. So cultural cluelessness, not an option. It's not an option for those of us in our TESOL profession. It will only get us to a place where we don't understand and we're not sensitive to our students' families, our students' communities. So not an option. The place where most people still are is cultural competence. And where I need you to be, because this is, even though many professionals don't know this term yet, they will in 5 years. And you need to know it right now because it is the place where we need to be. And this is cultural humility. It's about building relationships and being respectful and listening carefully. It's about recognizing the gifts that other people give you when they share information with you and reciprocating wherever you can. And it's about noticing at the end of the day the sameness, the ways that we are the same as humans. So that's cultural humility. So where do you go next? Below this lecture, the next thing that you'll see, and I want you to go to, is that chart that I mentioned. It's basically a T-chart. On one side it's cultural competence, on the other side it's cultural humility. And I did some thinking and reading about what are the key differences between them. And so what I've captured in that T-chart is how I make sense of it, and I hope you make sense of it too. And you might want to look at that and think about what I said and see about what those connections are in this lecture. The next place I want you to go is I want you to take a look at a sample culturegram. So right below that T-chart I mentioned is a culturegram, which is it's great evidence of a cultural competence approach. And the one that I found online that I want you to read is about the U.S. Okay, so you don't need to read it word for word, but I'd like you to glance over it, see what it describes, and then I want you to ask yourself a question. What about U.S. culture is not captured in this text? Okay, and I think it's maybe 3 or 4 pages, which is the norm for a country report. So just be noticing what doesn't get captured about life in the U.S., that if someone's relying on a culturegram, which is an example of a cultural competence text, what do they not know about our way of thinking, our ways of moving through the world? And then the next place that I want you to go is a really neat text that I found on Twitter in the past year. And it's called What's in a Name? And it basically comes from a student who was very upset that his name was never pronounced correctly. I think it was a male, I've forgotten. And so that's what kind of instigated this article. And the reason that I included it in this part of the unit is because when we think about respect, when we think about that respect that we need to give each other, it really starts with names. And it really got me thinking after I read that article, because what the article suggests is we may jokingly make comments about how difficult a name is for us to pronounce, or that we can't make certain sounds, and that's actually disrespectful to the student. And so I hope that in reading that article, it kind of helps you rethink how you think about names. And I really wish that I'd read that article before I taught any of my students over the last years. And the final place that I want you to go after this lecture, I've included 5 examples from Head Start articles that they provide to their employees. And they are essentially helping employees think about how everyday things like bedtime, going to the doctor, taking care of safety concerns, that kind of thing, how parents who've experienced a different culture, or who have experienced being refugees, they might approach these everyday things in a drastically different way. And there are 2 parts of each of the texts. There are 5 of them. They're very short. In fact, you may even want to print them out at some point, especially if you're thinking about working with preschoolers or elementary students for your own resources in the future. I want you to pay attention to the conversation starters at the top. I think they are wonderful examples of questions that you could actually ask someone. You could ask a parent, for example, a community member, that would help you understand the cultural values, perspectives, the ways of being around this concept like bedtime. And so those are great examples for us. And we, by the end of this course, will be asking others those kinds of questions. So you're going to move from someone taking in this information to someone who is practicing cultural humility and actually gathering that information yourself through relationship. So the other part of those 5 texts that I want you to pay attention to are what are called cultural considerations. So they're really nice bullet points that are things that we should probably remember about how other people might approach things differently, how they might approach, for example, bedtime or going to a doctor. And it also gives us insight into why that might be. Maybe how they've made sense of life, or what their experience have been that have led them to that sort of approach. Okay? So I hope that what happened as you listen to this lecture is that you got a really clear sense of the difference between cultural competence, which is where we were, and to be quite frank, that's where most of us still are in the TESOL profession. This is where we're moving, and this is where I need you to be with cultural humility. And again, we've taken that from nursing and from social work. So move on to the T chart and move on to the other texts, and I'll meet you in the discussion.